Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals. Some subject matters are large, and it's difficult to complete it in one setting. When I was in the legislature dealing with trying to get rid of the death penalty, the analogy I would use is that of a hippopotamus. And I'd tell them, were I a hippopotamus, you could put a bushel basket full of fruit in front of me. I could open that wide mouth and swallow it all in one gulp. But I'm not a hippopotamus. We're not dealing with a bushel basket full of fruit, but we're dealing with the death penalty. And there are a lot of people who are in favor of it. I am one of those strongly opposed, so I have to do it incrementally, a bite at the time, even though I like to swallow it in one gulp. This subject that I have today is going to have to take me 2 sessions to complete it. It's a very important one, and it is abortion. If men got abortions, if men were pregnant, and everything that's the way it is now would remain so, do you think a man would have trouble getting an abortion? Not at all. What they would do is say, "Come on in, old bloke." And you know who's saying that? McDonald's and Burger King. They would be giving the bloke an abortion with a side of fries and a Coke. And nobody would raise an eyebrow. No cat would whimper. And these men would consider their abortions the way that the old gunslingers considered shooting somebody and killing them, just another notch on the gun. Women are a majority of the population. That partially is explained by the fact that when wars occur, large numbers of men are killed. Women don't need to demonstrate in the street. They don't need to get frantic. They need to do what Black people and everybody else who has an issue needs to do. That's vote. Vote, vote. Politicians fear voters more than they fear anything and anybody else. One thing that happened just recently in Kansas is called a red state because the Republicans dominate. There are 350,000 more registered Republicans than there are Democrats in Kansas. The issue was put on the ballot as to whether or not a woman's right to abortion should remain a constitutional right in Kansas. And the people who favor women having the right to take charge of their own bodies and their own future voted to keep that right in place. By a vote in a state called a red state, the right of a woman to have an abortion remained in place. Kansas, of all places. So little Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz could go back to Kansas from the land of Oz, because if she wound up in that family way and didn't want it to be that way, she could go to Kansas and get an abortion. In Utah, they have, through the legislature, put in place one of those bonehead, silly white male bills, along with deluded white women, that would ban abortion in all situations except where the woman might die if there is not one. Fortunately, under the Biden administration, the Justice Department filed an action in federal court to strike that law down as violating the federal law. The federal law protects women's right more than the U.S. Supreme Court, where the racist, anti-women dominate, and I might add Catholics. What people don't realize is Catholics are the largest single religion in this country. There are not more Catholics than all other religions put together, but there are more Catholics than in any other religion. And right now, the Catholic doctrine, to a great extent on some issues, is driving the Supreme Court. There was a guy who took the name Mr. Dooley, and he wrote political satire and commentary many years ago. And he said he could not say whether the flag followed the Constitution, but he could say that the Supreme Court follows the election returns. And that's what this Supreme Court has done. And one of the biggest jackasses on there is Clarence Thomas, a handkerchief head Uncle Tom. And worse. What am I getting to? That women are protected to a greater extent by the federal government than by the U.S. Supreme Court. The argument made by the Justice Department is that federal law requires hospitals to provide the care a woman needs for her health, and not only when death might result if she doesn't get that help. So a woman having an abortion in Utah would be protected to a greater extent by what the U.S. Justice Department is doing than what the legislature in Utah has done and the simple-minded people in Utah have tolerated. I love women. I was born in bed with a woman. What right does some man or simple-minded woman have to dictate what another woman is going to do in the most personal area of her life? They're meddlesome. They're like the Puritans. They came from England to worship in their own way and make others do the same. I am going to read something from the Bible. I can find a biblical verse, I've told people, for everything. So in this case, I am going to spend some time giving my background through articles and other commentary in the newspaper. Will it be like boasting? Of course. But as I say, it's a poor car that won't toot its own horn. But let me, since people pretend to be Christians, or maybe Christians are the vicious people that history has shown, the Catholics who burn people alive at the stake. There's a woman called Joan of Arc who is a saint. The Catholic politicians in those days didn't like what she was doing, so they had her proclaimed a witch. They took all this wood and piled it up. They took this woman and tied her to the stake up and down, and then they lit the fire. And imagine what that would be like. Have you ever picked up a hot pot and you could let it go right away? Taking a sip of coffee that was hotter than you thought, out it goes. But have you ever thought of somebody taking your hand and putting it against the side of a red hot stove and holding it there? Take an electric stove where the eyes simply light up, no flame is in a gas stove, and put your hand on there and turn it up to the highest level where every circle is red, and hold your hand on it. The sizzling, the smoke, the stench of burning flesh. Imagine a woman being placed in that situation with the piles of wood, and the Christians, the Catholics, the Pope, the bishops, the archbishops, the priests, the nuns, the brothers, the deacons, all of them went for it in their official capacity, but there were Catholics opposed to it, and because they opposed that, they wound up at the stake themselves. They lit the fire, and amid this woman's screams, the smell of burning flesh, the smoke, her hair caught fire, and the Catholics got their jollies watching a woman burn to a crisp. That's Christianity. So I don't ever want to be mistaken for, blamed for, as, and insulted by being called a Christian. But let me read what a Christian wrote. He's considered the greatest of apostles, Paul. And this is from the Bible, the King James Version. 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, 16th verse. I say again, let no man think me a fool. If otherwise, yet as a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little. That which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. Seeing that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also. For ye suffer fools gladly, seeing ye yourselves are wise. For ye suffer, if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face, you suffer that. I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. Howbeit, whensoever any is bold, I speak foolishly. I am bold also. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors, more abundant. In stripes, that means lashes, above measure. In prisons, more frequent. In deaths, often. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 lashes, save one. 39 were the ones they give. They had the cat o' 9 tails, or this whip that had 3 prongs, and you got 13 of those, which gave you 39, or they might actually hit you 39 times. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice, that means 3 times, was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is offended, and I burn not? If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is blessed forevermore, knoweth that I lie not. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison, desirous to apprehend me. And through a window and a basket was I let down by the wall and escaped his hands. Paul said he was going to boast, and he boasted. And one other time he talked about the Hebrew of Hebrews. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel, the greatest rabbi of all time. But anyway, let me boast through the newspapers. This is dated June 3rd, 2001. Chambers again, a dominant force. I didn't write this. Quote, if it's hard, I get strong by doing my hard things, not by running. That's why I'll stand on this floor and oppose these bad bills when others will run for cover and try to be nice and coy. Let's pass it anyway and be good guys and women. So for me, I'm going to fight this. I'll fight it tooth and nail, and I'll fight it for 8 hours. Senator Ernie Chambers, March 12, on a bill relating to teen drinking, LB 114. They were going to put very harsh punishments against youngsters that did not apply to adults. And I did not believe in any person, any group, any race, religion, sex being opposed and oppressed by the laws that were put in place by the body of which I was a member. If this legislative session had been a horseshoe game, Governor Mike Johans would have been the state. Many horseshoe throwing senators were doing what they call their thing. But even as the governor's ideas shaped the broad contour of the session, the melodic voice of Senator Ernie Chambers of Omaha filled the legislative chambers, slowing debate for days, forcing some senators to change or abandon their bills, and in the end, assuring there would be no time for the controversial fetal homicide bill, which would make it a crime to kill an unborn child. It's the way the thing was written. These two personalities appeared to dominate the 2001 legislative session. Let me find my place. In the end, Johans got most of what he sought. Senators approved all but one of his more than a dozen major proposals. The Appropriations Committee followed the governor's lead on much of the mainline budget. Senators overrode only 2 of his more than 30 vetoes, and they refused to raise the sales tax to help school districts give teachers better pay raises, a proposal Johans promised to veto. And I was against the sales tax on any bill under any circumstances because it hurt the poor more than the rich. The poor paid exactly the same amount in sales tax as the rich people. In other words, Little Orphan Annie paid as much as Daddy Warbucks. Now, it was talking about these two personalities. This item that I started from did not have the matter written properly. But let me find it. I'm going to reread something that I read earlier. Even I make mistakes, but I make mine in public. But even as the governor's ideas shaped the broad contours of the session, the melodic voice of Senator Ernie Chambers of Omaha filled the legislative chambers, slowing debate for days, forcing some senators to change or abandon their bills, and in the end, assuring there would be no time for the controversial fetal homicide bill, which would make it a crime to kill an unborn child. The way they put it, if a woman had conceived from the point of conception, and if there were an accident of some kind, and that fetus or that embryo was destroyed, a person would be convicted of a crime. And I didn't go for that. These two personalities, the black man whom they hated, appeared to dominate the 2001 legislative session. A tenacious governor with a congenial way and 2 years' experience under his belt, and the clever senior senator, a master of the rules, a seasoned observer of human behavior, and a skillful orator. The thing that proves its quackery is the fact that doctors will use it who have no training in it, which means all you do is stick needles in people and they look like a pincushion, so they feel like they are better. They ought to call it porcupineology. Chambers, February 6th, on LB 270, a bill licensing acupuncturists. Said lobbyist Walt Radcliffe, he at that time was the most effective lobbyist, Once again, Chambers gets the Outland Award. He's the Defensive Player of the Year. Chambers, a state senator for 30 of his 63 years, slowed down several major business tax credit bills, helped rewrite the acupuncturist licensing bill, stopped the dairy compact bill, and a mandate that all gas stations sell ethanol. He helped move through better retirement benefits for veteran legislative staff consisting primarily of females. After talking for hour after hour during the session, Chambers' end of the session analysis of his role was succinct. I'm just doing the best I can with what I have to work with, trying to get wise, just, and fair legislation and prevent the enactment of legislation that is contrary to those principles. Said another veteran senator, Hebron Senator George Cordson, Senator Chambers is in fact the senior member, and I believe that carries with it a sense of responsibility, unquote. This year, Chambers seemed to intervene in matters that he may have ignored in past years, and his rhetoric in general was less angry, said Cordson. He does have a profound impact on how we legislate, said Speaker of the Legislature, Doug Christensen. How senators and others perceive that impact, he says, depends on where they stand. If you're on the same side, it is a positive impact. If you're on the other side, it is a negative impact. Chambers has a big picture mind. Only experience will give you that broad view, said the Speaker. Quote from Chambers, the Democratic Party supposedly, and I emphasize supposedly, is to be the party of the common people, the workers, women, the dispossessed, and the Republicans, on the other hand, are the party of the wealthy, the plunderers, the big corporations. That was Chambers, May 16th of that year, during a lecture to Democrats on how to use the filibuster. Chambers' influence and his verbosity frustrate many inside and outside the chamber. A legislative staff member resigned after Chambers accused him of racist behavior, and the Omaha senator spent hours attacking the Omaha public school system and several programs that spend tax dollars to private school teachers and students. Quote, he's a remarkable man, said Lincoln Senator Mike Foley, who had not become the lieutenant governor at that time. But he believes Chambers steps over the reasonable boundaries that ought to guide the use of a filibuster. Quote, there's a need to take a look at the rules and see if we can't revise them so that we can get more done for the good of Nebraskans, he said. In other words, this black man under our rules outsmarts us, so we have to change our rules to catch him because we can't use our own rules as well as he can. Continue. In fact, the legislature's Rules Committee will take a look at the cloture rule that allows 8 hours of debate before 33 senators can vote and end the talking altogether, said Malcolm Senator Carol Hudkins. Some senators believe the body ought to be able to cut off debate earlier, she said. But Lincoln Senator David Landis says there is a flaw in thinking different rules will resolve the issue. The solution, he said, is the will of the body to do its work. He, meaning Chambers, does provide the pattern on how a minority can protect its interests, said Cordson. It's always done within the rules. Other lawmakers also used the filibuster this year. Omaha Senator Nancy Thompson and Deb Suttle waged an 8-hour filibuster on a juvenile justice issue and eventually won a compromise with opponents. Rural senators filibustered the bill that earmarked part of the state's cigarette tax for 2 urban projects, Lincoln's Antelope Valley and Omaha's Riverfront. They argued the money should be used to maintain state property, to do the unglamorous work of putting on new roofs, tuck pointing old brick, and replacing old furnaces. Senators also spent 8 hours debating teacher salaries at the second stage of debate without Chambers' voice. Quote from Chambers, time is on my side, and on the side of the angels. Angels do not want to see what this bill is attempting to do to our young people. The angels who spend time dancing on the heads of pins, I don't know why they do that unless they're pin-headed angels. They have ceased their dancing on pins to observe what is happening in the Nebraska legislature. Chambers, March 12th, on a teen drinking measure. All those senators accomplished much, building a $5.5 billion budget, working through thorny redistricting issues without much open warfare, and passing more than 200 calls. There was little innovation and no crises. This was a session of manufactured or planned issues. There was no outside crisis that people had to respond to, said veteran lobbyist Walt Radcliffe. Events did not define the agenda. People formed the agenda, he said. Omaha Senator Kermit Bashir shared this opinion, quote, "This has been a session of small, large issues. We did not have any earth-shaking or mind-shattering issues." Here's something Chambers said. "Now, this is not X-rated, so nobody needs to go running out of here. Members of the legislature, for too long in Nebraska, too many people have had their noses in other people's crotches. They're concerned about what consenting adults do behind closed doors with other consenting adults, and I have no concern with that. I do have concern about human beings. I believe that anything born of a man and a woman, born, I emphasize, is a human being." Chambers, April 3rd, on a proposal to ban housing discrimination against gays and lesbians. Johans eventually vetoed the measure, and I continued to fight for the rights of those people. Johans, the governor, benefited from his collegial working style and longevity, according to Speaker Christensen. Traditionally, governors' second and third years are their best. I'm skipping some of this. Oh, talking about the governor's accomplishments, the governor's getting a little credit here. His accomplishments during the session that ended Thursday include 8 new Nebraska State Patrol troopers, tax credits for businesses that create daycare programs and bring jobs to Nebraska, a program to help Nebraska entrepreneurs get venture capital, breast and cervical cancer treatment coverage for low-income women, a forgivable loan program for students who plan to teach. Other senators said times were right for Johans' message of limited incremental change. There was unanimity between the majority of my colleagues and the executive branch, said Lincoln Senator David Landis. If you have that much agreement, it's a pretty quiet session. Sid Cordson, it's been my observation that some things are just going to happen. The real question about leadership often is framed this way, he said. Is the person ahead of the mob a leader or being chased? This is my quote. The king cobra does not waste venom on dead things. Chambers, April 5th, on why he did not speak much on a bill that would prohibit the University of Nebraska from using fetal tissue in research. Now I'm getting to the issue of abortion. A letter was written to me by a firm that was opposed to a bad abortion bill. Dear Senator Chambers, I'm writing this letter of appreciation together with Simon Heller. I think what I'm going to do is take this up during the second portion or the next session that I take so that I won't have to rush through it. I will spend a little more time on what I was speaking of here in terms of my own activities. I have always, once I began to think for myself, done what I believe was right for me to do. And even on that, I have a quote from Paul the Imposter. He said words to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, When I was a child, I thought as a child, I spoke as a child, I believed as a child, I behaved as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. There were many things in the religion of the brand presented in the church of which I was a member called the Church of God in Christ, I-N. Some people who are not familiar with that church call it the Church of God and Christ. It is the word in, God in Christ, which shows how little regard people have for that particular denomination because they didn't take time to even find the name of it. But many people in that church were older. They couldn't read. They pretended that they could. And they would hear something quoted or read, and they wouldn't get it right. One person, he was a traveling evangelist. They go around the country trying to make living, hustling these churches who believe anything somebody from another state will come and give them. They're so flattered that somebody from someplace else came to talk to them. He said, the Bible talks about the time coming when men gonna be running around here in their underwear, dragging out these crazy women and taking them off and doing bad things to them. The Bible didn't say they will come in their underwear or take women out in their underwear. It said they will enter windows at night, leading away foolish women unawares, tricking them. There was a person who was a minister, and he couldn't read, so he would have to approximate words. There's a book in the Bible as I say, it is Colossians. There's a place called Colossus, and the people who lived there were Colossians. He had never read the word because he couldn't, and the closest word he could think of was galoshes. So he was going to preach a sermon, and he said, my subject comes from galoshes, and he gave the verse, and it was all the people could do who knew how to read, keep from falling to the floor in gales of laughter. If you don't know something, don't pretend you know, because your ignorance will find you out. I've told you all this before, a lot of hypocrites in these churches. So this one guy came. Now, not only was he a traveling evangelist, but he wore a black robe and it had a red inner lining. And sometimes he would throw his collar back so they could see it was red. And he could speak the king's English the way the king would speak it. And he even mispronounced English if the Bible mispronounced it. And in talking about David killing Goliath, the Bible said that David took this stone and slang it, S-L-A-N-G. Slang is a word that relates to very colloquial speech, but he's slang it. But anyway, this preacher said, God can do whatever he wants to do with the king's English. Well, God didn't speak English. The Bible was translated from various languages under the order of King James. And that's when the King James Version came into being. And they had various scholars. Some of them were drunks. Some of them were adulterers. Others were other unsavory people, but they were scholars. And when they came to a particular passage and they couldn't agree on how to translate it, they did it not by praying to God and fasting. They took a vote and majority ruled. So there are things in the Bible that got there as a result of a vote of these scholars who are translating it pursuant to the order of King James. Now, how do I know that? Because I read and I can understand what I read. But at any rate, these churches are a place where you can get an education like no place else. While I was there, I believed what these old people told me, but I could read. And I read the Bible for myself, but I would not contradict anything they said because they were mean-spirited. They liked to swat children. They liked to hit them with switches in Sunday school class if they didn't know the answer, even though the Bible said, suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not. He didn't say, bring the little children to me and make them suffer. So these church people got some of their clauses in the wrong order to justify what they were doing. But there were some things that I picked up in church that stayed with me because they made sense. And one of the things that made sense to me, which they didn't practice in that church, was that I cannot justify any wrongdoing I do by the wrongdoing of somebody else. I cannot make myself strong by standing on somebody else's shoulders and pushing them down. I could not blame somebody else for the wrong that I did when I knew it was wrong that I did it. So that principle of being responsible for my actions has stayed with me. And when I gave that affirmation, when I became a senator, that I would discharge the duties of this office to the best of my ability, that meant that even though I was elected by district, I was a state senator. Therefore, every resident, not just citizen, because there were people who were what they call undocumented people and others from other states. Any resident within the confines of the state of Nebraska would be my constituent. And if anyone brought to me a problem, and it was a legitimate problem, that person or those people, the one was or the group were being harmed in some way by the government, a governmental agency, or a person, and it fell within the range of what I ought to do as a state senator, that person got my help. And that's why I got called from all over the state. When the farmers were in serious trouble, they wanted me to go to Washington and represent them because they said I knew enough about agriculture, more about it than most people who were in it. That's because I read, I studied, and I understood what I read. And they wanted me to go there, and they signed a petition with hundreds of signatures to establish that I was indeed the one who would speak for them. And I told them, that is not one of my duties. You have to get one of your own to do that. And the general consensus was, but none of our own know agriculture like you do. Nobody has studied the law like you do. But more than that, nobody will be true to our interests like you will be. I said, well, be that as it may, I won't do it. You're going to have to call your representatives to account. Call those you voted for to account. But those that you voted for who are not taking care of your interests, as well as I take care of your interests, are doing things to harm the people who sent me down here. If I would tolerate it, they would lash me with a whip. And if it weren't for the federal government, they would still be putting on pillowcases, bed sheets, and carrying an American flag and torches and lynching us and burning us alive in a Christian ceremony. Those are the things I would give back to these people. And I told them, put the pressure on those who represent you to do what you say that you believe I would do for you. When if I was going to conduct myself in the way your representatives do, I would tell you every time you come to me, go to Senator so-and-so, or to all of you, go to the white senators. You have 48 of them, and you're going to come to the one black man. Then you're going to try to make me feel like it's my obligation to do these things because I know more than the others, or I will stand up more firmly than the others. That is not my responsibility. And that's when I tell them, you white people. And they say, we don't like to be referred to that way. I say, why? Are you not white people? They say, but when you say you white people, I say, then what you have done is just explain to yourself why we as black people don't like to be referred to by white people as you people. And you don't want to believe that a shoe pinches until it's on your foot. pinching your foot. You don't want to believe that a child can go to bed hungry because his parents have not enough money to purchase food until you lost your job and now your children are hungry. And who do you go to? The black man that you hate. And I think that you hate him more for being better than what your representatives are than for being black. But as long as I'm black and my hair is going to turn gray, and you can see I've kept that oath, it's not an oath, that declaration, I remain black, and I know my skin is not black as black is viewed, but I make these white people sit up and take notice when I say, yeah, I'm black, and were I blacker, I could be prouder. They couldn't make me ashamed of what I am or embarrass me. And I'll tell them the Muslims got it right when they call Chambers my slave name. There are no Chamberses in Africa, but there were slaveholders with that name. I don't know what my name would be had not my ancestors been captured, shipped to this country, and treated like livestock, raped, murdered, tortured, and brutalized. And then I would tell them that the Muslims, because they didn't know their real name, as I don't know mine, would substitute the letter X, which stood for unknown. And that's how Malcolm Little became Malcolm X. And then later Malik el-Shabazz, after he'd gone to Saudi Arabia, to Mecca. But there are a lot of things that Black people have suffered in America that have been suffered by no people as a race anywhere else on the face of this earth. Yet we're held to a higher standard than white people hold themselves and their own kind, which is an acknowledgement, if you will, of Black superiority. We are stronger. We are more trustworthy. They trust us with their little babies. They trust us to cook their food without poisoning them. A Black woman discovered that some food was going to be fed to George Washington that would have poisoned him, and she saved the scoundrel, even though he had so many slaves, that when the Southerners rebelled against the Union, they wanted to make George Washington their patron because he was a slaveholder just as they were. Now, as I always terminate it, in the words of the canary, who was notified that the cage was ajar, I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.